In the parish we were part of when my kids were younger, every couple of years, the youth ministry program offered the teenagers the opportunity to participate in a service project for an orphanage in Jamaica called Mustard Seed. Now, this was not the Jamaica you'd see if you went there for vacation. This was the hot and poor Jamaica that's beyond where the tourists go. And this was not an orphanage with a lot of healthy children, rather a place for disabled children, many with disabilities so severe they might not even be able to speak or do much of anything for themselves. It was not an easy trip. After a long plane ride, the group would get on a bus for a 2-hour ride further into Jamaica in heat like they'd never experienced before. And then they spent a week feeding children who couldn't feed themselves, and carrying children who couldn't walk, and talking to children who sometimes couldn't speak. But the inability to speak didn't mean they couldn't communicate. They could, and they did return the love that they were being shown, by laughing and smiling and just the look in their eyes. And like Jesus in the gospel today, these young adults put their arms around these children and embraced them. And those courageous enough to make this journey would come back transformed. I remember a young man showing his photos from the trip to his friends, and he was getting choked up as he went through his photos because when he saw the faces in his pictures, he realized how much he had grown to love those kids. Transformed. Not just by seeing poverty and need like they'd never seen it before, but rather by an experience of God's love. An encounter with Christ himself, whether they recognized him in those eyes or not. In our gospel today, Jesus tells us to serve one another. But mustard seed is an example of how we also find Jesus in serving one another. It's just one example. And for most of the ways Jesus gives us to serve, we don't have to travel very far. We find Jesus in prayer and in silence, to be sure, but we also find him in service. And we might ask ourselves, well, why is that? Well, it might be because Jesus is the perfect expression of service, right? The king who washes feet. And he calls us to follow him, and he says in John's gospel, "My servant will be with me where I am. I will be with that servant who serves." Or maybe it's because God is so much about love that St. John can say God is love, and service is the expression of love. For the past 4 weeks, our second reading has been coming from the letter of James. And last week, James told us that faith without works is dead. Do you remember that? Works are the expression of faith, the sign that faith is real. And we can say the same thing about love. Where there are no acts of love, there really isn't any love. But where there is love, we will find God, because, as the scripture says, God is love. And probably we find Jesus in acts of service because Jesus told us we would find him there. In today's gospel, but in other places too. When he talked about helping the poor, the sick, those in prison, he said, "Whenever you did this for anyone, even the least among you, you did it for me." I was there, he's saying. And today, after calling us to service, he takes a child in his arms. Why? Because a child is someone in need. And a child's not powerful. A child's more like the least among us, right? And he says, if you receive one like this, you receive me. I'm there. Service is the expression of the Christian life. It is at the heart of what the followers of Jesus do. Mother Teresa used to teach that the whole gospel could be summed up in your 5 fingers. You did it for me. Those words, are from Jesus' teaching on the final judgment that we just mentioned. And that is a vivid picture of the truth that service is the key to life with Jesus, now and later, right? Remember, serving those in need is how Jesus separates those who are going to be with him from those who aren't. The distinction is not between those who committed great crimes and those who didn't. It's between those who served others and those who didn't. The key to the only final exam that matters is between serving only yourself and serving others. Between selfishness and love. That is the decision in life. And that's not bad news because the standard might be higher than we thought. That's good news because it tells us that the path to happiness in the next life is the same as the path to happiness in this life. Love is the path to heaven, and it's also the only path to happiness in this life. And that's what James is saying this week, where there's, quote, jealousy and selfish ambition, close quote, where there is selfishness, he says, there are all kinds of problems. And for a picture of selfish ambition, just turn the page, right? An argument about who's the greatest. James goes on to talk about conflicts. And note that Jesus doesn't say, what were you talking about? He says, what were you arguing about? A little bit of conflict. James, where do the conflicts among you come from? Your passions, meaning what you want for yourself. He says, you covet, you envy. Those are all expressions of selfishness. James is telling those he's writing to that they're unhappy because they're selfish. Putting yourself first leads to unhappiness. The opposite of that, serving others, a life of love, is the path, the only path, to happiness. And we don't have to get on a plane to find that path. An immersion in service, like a week taking care of orphans, in poverty like you've never been able to imagine, that can be a powerful experience. But God's usually calling us to service much closer to home. Remembering Mother Teresa again, she often told those who offered to help her, bloom where you're planted. And she'd say, Calcutta is all around you if you have eyes to see. Very often our call is simply the children in our homes, or the elderly parent, or the spouse or the family member who's ill, the neighbor who's frail and having difficulty. With love, right? Jesus says, receive in my name. Receive how Jesus would receive. Maybe the nearby hospital or the nursing home, or the food drive at the parish, or teaching catechism or RCIA. But it's probably not far away. So today, Scripture gives us some answers to the question everyone in the world is asking. The path to the full life, the abundant life. Father said just last week, Jesus wants the abundant life for us now. I came that they may have life and have it to the full. He wants us to have the abundant life now. Well, a couple answers today. First, what the world tells us is wrong. We do not find happiness putting ourselves first. We find disorder and we find conflict. We find happiness not only in the next life, but in this life, in a life of love. And second, in living that life, we will find the one we seek. We're probably here today not just because we want to worship the Lord, but also because we long to find him, to grow in a relationship with him. Augustine said, "Lord, our hearts are restless until they rest in you," and we know that's true. But how do we find him, right? Some days we say, "Lord, where are you?" How do we find him? Well, today he tells us one way. The one we're longing for says, "Whoever receives one such as this in my name receives me and receives the one who sent me."